On March 10th, 1971, a 29-year-old Lou Reed sat before an audience of writers, musicians and artists gathered at the St. Mark's Church in New York and announced his retirement from the world of rock and roll in favour of the written word. "I'm a poet," Reed announced to the hesitant crowd, who had all arrived in anticipation to witness Reed's first ever poetry reading and his first public showing since leaving the Velvet Underground in August of 1970. In the interval between the two, Reed had lived at home with his parents working as a typist in his father's accountancy firm, and in his spare time, lived a reclusive life in his room where he would write poetry and contribute literary pieces to local journals. Many may have been surprised to hear the drastic change in direction Reed had taken, yet for Reed, this was simply a returning to old habits. Reed's initial ambitions as a young man were to be a writer and to write the great American novel. However, this ambition had been sidetracked by an ever-growing love of music, which he prioritised for many years. But with his continual commercial failure in the Velvet Underground, who only saw widespread acclaim years after they broke up, Reed had left the band and returned to his parents' home in Freeport, Long Island to re-evaluate his life's direction. Upon re-evaluation, the obvious answer seemed to be to fully dedicate himself to writing, and that he did for a brief stint, culminating in the one-time poetry reading of various poems, song lyrics and short prose in 1971, which was a successful performance. 6 months later, however, Reed would return to music and begin recording his first album as a solo artist. Whilst this crossroads in Reed's life may have directed him towards dropping what had made a small name for himself at the time, the brief departure from music had allowed him to understand where his talents lie in regards to the written word. Reed found that his talent did not lie in rejecting rock music in pursuit of writing the great American novel, but that it in fact lies in bringing the sensitivities of the novel to rock music. Bringing the sensitivities of the novel to rock music had thus become Reed's mission moving forward into his solo career. However, upon looking back on Reed's work with the Velvet Underground between 1964 to 1970, we can see the literary influence have its effect on Reed's contributions to the band, and if we were looking for a point in which to signify a beginning, I would argue it lies in his college years. Reed's college years began in 1960 at Syracuse University in New York. He was 18 years old. Reed had majored in English and took classes in journalism, film direction and creative writing, the last of which introduced him to his lecturer Delmore Schwartz, who would prove to become a huge influence on Reed, and someone Reed would continuously praise for the remainder of his life. Delmore Schwartz was an American poet and short story writer, who, by the time he met Reed, was 48 years old, had an extensive catalogue of work published, and, only a year prior, won the Bullinger Prize for a book of his containing his poetry, making him the youngest person at that time to do so. Long before working as a lecturer at Syracuse, where he taught literature and creative writing, Schwartz had momentarily been viewed as the next big up-and-coming writer in the late 1930s, when he released his first book titled In Dreams Begin Responsibilities. In Dreams Begin Responsibilities was a collection of short stories Schwartz published in 1938 when he was 25 years old, and the reaction from the literary world to this publication, specifically to the short story sharing the same name as the book's title, caught the attention of many famous writers such as T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams, all of whom praised Schwartz for his genius. As was to be expected from this high praise, Schwartz had felt as if he were just beginning a promising career as a writer, yet unfortunately, Schwartz was never, in the eyes of the critics at least, able to contend with his first release, due in part to a decline in his physical and mental health and struggles with alcoholism. Schwartz's decline in health was a slow one that by 1960 had become visible to everybody, but nonetheless, Reed had still seen the genius in him that people saw many years prior, and because of that, Reed took to Schwartz as a creative mentor, while Schwartz, who recognised Reed's talent as a writer, willingly embraced this role. The two would thus spend countless hours drinking in a bar not too far from the Syracuse campus called the Orange Bar, where they would discuss literature. Schwartz would also gather other students from his class to the bar to read works from James Joyce and hold big discussions. Many people who had encountered Schwartz would always praise him as a conversationalist, and it has been said that, during these talks of writers or poetry in general, a fire would be ignited within him, and for the duration of the conversation, the old Schwartz would briefly return. One drunken night at the Orange Bar, a night no different from the rest. Reed and Schwartz had been engaged in yet another one of their conversations on writing, when suddenly Schwartz leaned over the table to Reed and warned him that if he ever sold out or quit writing, then Schwartz would haunt him. Reed would carry this warning with him for the rest of his life. While Schwartz had acted as an interesting personality to talk and drink with during Reed's time at college, he had also inspired and helped Reed to shape his now infamous simple style of writing in his lyrics. When commenting on In Dreams Begin Responsibilities in an interview conducted in 1997, Reed praised Schwartz's ability to write both simply but deeply. There was an example of how, with the simplest language imaginable, very short, you could accomplish the most astonishing height of art. It's probably the most incredible short story I ever read. You know, I read that when I was in college, and it changed my life forever. Schwartz's own ability to accomplish astonishing heights with the simplest language had inspired in Reed a desire to do the same, which became a style of writing he implemented into his songwriting in his final years of college, as music began to take front and centre in Reed's artistic pursuits. Coming to the close of Reed's time at college, he would consider the only thing worthwhile from his own wretched college experience was meeting Delmore Schwartz, and he would also later hold him in the highest regard of people he had personally encountered, claiming, "Delmore was the first great person I ever met." Reed graduated from Syracuse University in 1964 with a BA in English, and soon moved to New York after getting a job as a staff songwriter at a budget label. He would frequently write to Schwartz during this time. In the same year, Reed, alongside John Cale, Sterling Morrison, and Angus MacLeese, who would be replaced the following year by Moe Tucker, formed the Velvet Underground. The band name was taken from the title of a book by author Michael Lee, published in 1963. The book itself is a reporting of the, at the time, increasing shift in attitudes towards sexuality and paraphilia. Following a few months of chaotic live shows, the band was picked up, managed and financed by artist Andy Warhol. By the 12th of March 1967, the band had released their first album titled The Velvet Underground and Nico. When considering the lyrical content Reed contributed to the songs, the influence of Schwartz in the simplicity of the language is apparent in each song. However, when considering the subject matter Reed writes about, we can look to writers such as William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, Raymond Chandler, and Hubert Selby. On the topic of Reed's subject matter early in his songwriting career, he said he didn't look to other songs for inspiration, but instead to books. "I wanted to put Burroughs in a song, or Ginsberg. You know, those were lyrics for me. Howl, Naked Lunch, Hubert Selby, Last Exit to Brooklyn, that stuff. And of course, Delmore mixed that all together." It is also worth mentioning that the subject matter Reed writes about is also relevant to his own experience, yet it was the unapologetic way in which these writers wrote of their similar experiences that convinced Reed he could do the same. One example of this is found in the second song on the album called I'm Waiting for the Man. I'm Waiting for the Man tells the story of a dope fiend waiting for his drug dealer, the man, in order to score some heroin. Told in the first person, the song begins with the narrator describing the sick feeling he has as he waits for the man near the intersection of Lexington Avenue in New York, whilst clutching $26 in his hand. The narrator notes the interactions he has with the people around the area who ask him why he's hanging around, to which he responds he's just waiting for a friend. Eventually, the man arrives late, a fact that does not surprise the narrator, and takes the narrator to a brownstone where he gets his fix and quickly leaves in order to get home and shoot up. As the narrator walks home, he is satisfied for the remainder of the day, knowing that tomorrow he will repeat the process all over again. Through the length of time in which this story is told, the musical accompaniment sonically portrays the anxiety felt by the narrator as he anticipates the arrival of the man, as the instrumentals pound incessantly to replicate that of a thudding heartbeat. The story of a man waiting to get his fix is reminiscent of an author like Burroughs, who has written about street life and particularly the many facets of being an addict, and especially the desperation of a dope fiend suffering withdrawals and attempting to get his fix. As is commonly known, Reed's own experience with drug abuse has been well documented, so it is no surprise that an author like Burroughs, who suffered similar addictions and wrote them into his art, would inspire Reed to do the same. When questioned on the authenticity of the song years later, Reed would respond, "Everything about that song holds true, except the price." Venus in Furs is the fourth song off the album, and is another example of a literary influence. However, is different from the rest of the tracks because it pulls directly from a novella. The novella itself is of the same name, and was written by Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, who had it published in 1870. To summarise, the story of Venus in Furs consists of a European nobleman whose name is Severin, who desires to be and eventually is enslaved by the recently widowed Wanda, whose methods in degrading Severin become more severe as she adapts to the role. The term masochist was actually taken from Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's name, and when the book was originally published, its contents had disgusted many readers, yet still held a small cult following of men and women who presumably held similar desires. In the song itself, Reed covers many plots of the book in the verses, whilst interjecting feelings of depression and exhaustion within the chorus. Similar to the initial reaction to the book, the song had garnered a hefty amount of backlash due to the subject matter, and reviewers would often give negative feedback on the subject matter alone. Reed would be dumbfounded by this supposed disgust, as all he had done was take the contents of a book and made it into a song. I got a little puzzled at how savage the reaction against us was, especially when we performed live and played out of New York. Like, you know, how savage and decadent and da-da-da-da, and look at what these songs are about, Venus in Furs is about all of this. They didn't even know Venus in Furs was a book. I didn't write it. You know, I just said, it would be interesting to take this book and put it in a song. I just wanted to cram everything into a record these people had ignored, which left you everything. And the other thing that killed me was, like, you know, stuff like this had been in novels and it was almost like nothing. I write a song called Heroin and you would have thought I murdered the Pope or something. Heroin is the 7th song on the album, and is in my opinion, the best song. Reed wrote Heroin while studying at Syracuse. The song itself is unsurprisingly a detailing of the act of shooting up and the subsequent euphoria felt by Reed in doing so. As well as this, Reed describes the desperate mindset of a man whose only sense of euphoria is attainable through shooting up. This can be seen in lines that describe Reed's desire to escape the oppressive city of New York, his desire not to care about the political climate or any problems in the world, and his increasing lack of understanding as to why he feels the way he does and why he continues to shoot up to not feel that way. Reed concludes these thoughts at the tail end of every verse with the line, "I guess that I just don't know." This concluding line can be attributed to many aspects of the song. Does he not know where his life is heading? Does he not know why he continues to shoot up? Or maybe he just doesn't know why he bothers at all. There are many interpretations you can take from it. Once again, the unapologetic directness of Reed's subject matter can be attributed to all those authors mentioned prior, as, at the time of the album having been released, topics like this were not spoken about as bluntly as Reed had chosen to. Schwartz's influence in the wording of Reed's lyrics can be seen here too, as the language used is colloquial and often simple, yet still manages to convey the disruptive thoughts of Reed, especially in verses such as the third, where Reed talks about wishing to be born 1,000 years ago so he could adventure around the world on a great big clipper ship. The sense you get from these wishes is dissatisfaction and a longing for something unattainable. Or a feeling that to Reed may only feel attainable by shooting up on heroin. Lastly, European Sun is the 11th and final song on the album. The band had recorded European Sun sometime in 1966, but unfortunately, a few months prior to it having been recorded, Schwartz had suffered a heart attack and died in his hotel room on the 11th of July. He was 52 years old. Towards the end of his life, Schwartz's issues had only gotten worse, and he had subsequently locked himself away from everybody else for an entire year. Schwartz had died of a heart attack in the Columbia Hotel in New York, yet due to him being a recluse at this time, his being dead wasn't noticed, and his body was discovered 3 days following his death. Understandably, Reed was deeply affected by this, and wanted to honour his mentor by dedicating a song to him. The choice of European Sun had been chosen because of its lack of words, as Schwartz had frequently commented on his disdain for rock lyrics. Guitarist Sterling Morrison expanded on this in an interview years later. Everyone thinks it's because the song is thematically appropriate. You killed your European son, you spit on those under 21. Incidentally, that may be true because Delmore was the son of Jewish emigres and a great poet, who was never accepted, but the real reason is that it has only 2 stanzas of lyrics and a long instrumental break. Delmore thought rock and roll lyrics were the worst things he'd ever heard in his life. He despised songs with words. As this was our big instrumental outing on the album, we dedicated it to him. Following the release of the Velvet Underground and Nico, the band would release another 3 albums with Reed's involvement. Reed would continue to produce lyrics that tackled similar themes and unspoken subject matters, like sexual experimentation, drugs, and city life in New York. In the band's follow-up album, Reed references meth in the album opener White Light, White Heat, has Cale read a short story Reed wrote whilst at Syracuse in The Gift, tells the story of a botched lobotomy on a trans woman in Lady Godiva's Operation, and on the 17-minute album closer called Sister Ray, Reed tells the story of a group of transvestites engaged in a drug-fueled orgy. The subject matter of sexual experimentation and changing of genders continues in their 3rd album The Velvet Underground in Candy Says, and Reed also experiments with reading multiple poems at the same time in The Murder Mystery. Lastly, on the album Loaded, released after Reed's departure from the band, Reed's lyrics still hit on similar themes. Overall, Reed's simple and colloquial language that routinely features in his lyrics can be argued to have been inspired by Schwartz's own work and further moulded under his tutelage. Additionally, the subject matter, as well as relating to Reed's own experiences, was influenced to be deemed as something worth putting into his songs due to the frequent mention of drugs by Burroughs and Chandler, or the mention of transvestites and unflinching stories of sexual experimentation in the works of Selby. There are obviously far more songs and influences that can be pulled from, but I would argue these writers were some of the biggest influences, and the songs I picked out are some of the most shining examples of this influence. I used to be in a rock and roll group. Some people told me that some of the songs I did were unintelligible, so I decided I'd read you some of the more unintelligible songs without music. This is just one of many interjections Reed had made during the poetry reading that took place on March 10th, 1971 at the St. Mark's Church. Of the unintelligible songs he mentions in this quote, Reed read old Velvet Underground lyrics, beginning with Sister Ray, then Heroin, the Black Angels' Death Song, taken from their first album, Lady Godiva's Operation, and lastly, The Murder Mystery. Prior to Reed reading these lyrics, he had opened his performance by reading some published letters to a sex therapist called Astrology and Sex. Reed had then spent the rest of the performance reading 11 poems, 1 short story, and 2 more sets of lyrics. The first of the set of lyrics was called Andy Warhol's Chest. This would later turn into the song Andy's Chest on Reed's solo album Transformer. The second set of lyrics was called The Coach and the Glory of Love, which would become Coney Island Baby from Reed's solo album of the same name. Between these pieces, Reed would include introductions that were often humorous, and he would also engage with the audience regularly throughout. Before reading out Heroin, Reed had prefaced it with this: "This is the song that made it all possible, folks. At this time, Bob Dylan was kind of popular, and everybody said, 'Hey, that's the real thing coming out.' I said, 'Fabulous, that means I could do this.' No, not true. And the Beatles had just come out with I Want to Hold Your Hand. So I came out with Heroin." Reed had set a tape recorder down on the night of the reading, capturing the entire performance on side A of the tape, with side B being left blank. You can find small snippets of this recording online. Of the 11 poems Reed read in the middle of the performance, one of them, called Spirited Leaves of Autumn, told of the experiences Reed had had during his time at Syracuse University. The poem mentions the warning Schwartz had made to Reed years ago. "I'll haunt you if you quit," he warned me, "playing Bloom to my Daedalus one drunken reeling night in college." The reference to Bloom and Daedalus calls back to Stephen Daedalus in James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and Leopold Bloom in Ulysses. Joyce was one of Schwartz's favourite authors. Before reading Spirited Leaves of Autumn, however, Reed would yet again preface the reading with a small introduction, but this time on a less jovial note. "This is when I was back, a youth in college. I have to have a cigarette for this. It's called Spirited Leaves of Autumn. It's about dreams." This is for Delmore Schwartz, by the way. To the sound of applause, Reed had exited the stage of the St. Mark's Church with his cassette tape and pieces of paper in hand, knowing his new pursuit of poetry was one worth going for. The positive response from the audience was enough to convince Reed that his public denouncement of rock and roll was the right choice, as having now been validated in doing so, Reed felt a whole new world of possibilities open up for him. However, as previously stated, it would only take 6 months for Reed to make a 180 and begin recording his first album as a solo act, and by 1972, Reed had reached levels of fame and success likely unattainable by poetry alone. Despite focusing on his solo work for his remaining years, Reed would continue to commemorate Delmore Schwartz in interviews and his music. The last time Reed would do so is when he wrote a piece of prose titled "Oh Delmore, How I Miss You," which was published in June 2012. In 2018, 5 years following Reed's death, a collection of Reed's poetry that he read on the stage of the St. Mark's Church in 1971 was published in the book "Do Angels Need Haircuts?" The book captures the small interval in which Reed had dedicated himself to poetry, and includes various poems, prose, and also photographs. When looking back on this small interval, Reed's brief change in artistic pursuit had helped him better understand how to take this talent he had for writing and implement it into his songs, which, moving forward into his solo career, is what he did. Especially in albums like Berlin or New York, where the songs work to tell a cohesive narrative throughout the entire album, with the musical accompaniment complementing these long and drawn out stories. When Reed returned to making music 6 months after his poetry reading, it seems he had done so not with the intention of separating these two artistic paths and choosing one, but instead moulding the two together to create a hybrid of sorts, rejecting a full embrace of either the lifestyle of a poet or a rock star, and instead becoming what we now refer to him as today, as Lou Reed, punk poet.